First up, a straight apology. This is not really my presentation or my slides. I'm going to do the absolute best that I can to give you a good insight and an interesting insight into the survey that's been undertaken, but I may not be able to answer all of your questions at the end. So what am I talking to you about today? The Characterising Community Survey that we undertook as a group, we being AARG, under the auspices of the EAC Remote Sensing Working Group. So most of you will be familiar with the EAC Working Group. It is a partnership between ourselves and ISAP. Rachel Opitz and Chris Gaffney lead on that. And they're also it's the umbrella under which we're also doing the LiDAR guidelines work. So within that remote sensing working group, what they're doing is working towards the EAC aims, which are to help support heritage management across the continent of Europe. And how can we do that? Well, one of the things that was done last year for ISAP members was to undertake a survey to try and characterise the profession. So what we really want to know is who is doing what and where and how. What are the problems? What are the potential solutions? And essentially what we're trying to provide in both of these surveys, both the ISAP members survey last year and the AARG members and wider community survey this year, is a baseline. We're trying to make a starting point from which we can understand and characterise how aerial archaeology and remote sensing is being undertaken across Europe, and the kind of things that we think are coming up that might be both opportunities and barriers to applications. So this survey was undertaken over 10 weeks at the beginning of this year, between May and June. We had more than 55 responses. So these responses were split, as with the LiDAR survey, for institutions and individuals. So you could respond on behalf of an organisation and talk about the way that the organisation handles remote sensing, or you could speak about your particular role. The reason that we did this, both for the LiDAR survey and for this characterising the profession survey, is that it's really interesting to see the difference in dynamic between how an individual working with remote sensing is approaching their profession and the things that they do, and how an organisation who is employing people or looking to use remote sensing is operating. But also because if we just focus, say, for example, on organisations, that would exclude quite a lot of people who are working self-employed or as individuals or as researchers who don't sort of sit within the umbrella of an organisation. So for us to properly try and capture the demographic, we need to ask both questions. What that does mean is that some people will have responded both on behalf of themselves and on behalf of an organisation that they work for. So you have a sort of double entry respect to the data there. So as you can see here, we had pretty good coverage from institutions and relatively good coverage from individuals as well in terms of the geographic spread. And we did also get some individuals responding from outwith Europe too, which, you know, is interesting also to start to understand the more global spread of our discipline. A quick and quite boring slide here, so apologies for that. But really, I just wanted to show you the kind of breakdown of which sort of organisations and which type of roles responded to the survey. And I think the one thing to see, you can all read the slide through for yourself here, is that we had a reasonably good response rate from individuals, both as researchers and commercial archaeologists, and a reasonably good response rate from academic researchers and development-led archaeology. But to put this in context, so a 2021 report done by Doug Ox-McQueen and co surveyed the entire archaeological profession in the UK to try and understand the numbers of organisations. And so they concluded that more than 200 universities were offering courses related to archaeology, and that there were more than 1,000 independent archaeological organisations. So looking at those numbers, sort of 200 universities, 1,000 independent archaeology organisations, and then taking a look at the scale of these, we need to understand how representative this is of the total number of people working within it. So it looks like a really low response rate, but we also know, as we spoke about this morning, that aerial archaeology and remote sensing is a small specialism within a much broader subject. So further work on understanding where this research sits within the wider discipline would be useful to pick apart how representative these responses actually are. We looked at we asked people what sort of things that they use remote sensing and archaeology for. The format of the form was predominantly a quantitative survey, so people could use checkbox and radio controls in order to be able to give quite standardized responses. And the idea of that is to allow us to take that baseline and then repeat the survey at periodic intervals. I think probably about a 5-year interval would seem appropriate, although that will be for discussion with the AAC and our committee. So trying to make it as easy as possible for them to respond. However, there was a mix of qualitative responses as well. We asked people to give comments and views, and we'll take a look at some of those at the end of this talk, because it does provide a quite interesting insight into people's feelings around where they are at the minute. So as you can see, the vast majority of organisations are using remote sensing and aerial photography for project planning, desk-based assessment, and the supportive field work, and then followed by site identification. Perhaps the thing that's outstanding from this particular graph is that public engagement seems to fall really low on the sort of registered users. Also bearing in mind that people could pick more than one choice here, but across the scale, across the responses, public engagement was quite low. Now, I think that we're probably using remote sensing and aerial photography quite a lot in terms of public engagement, but perhaps we're not really thinking about that as part of our job. Maybe we're doing it of an evening, perhaps we're doing it as something alongside our main role. And so I think that the actual use of remote sensing, or Rachel and I think that the actual use of remote sensing and aerial imagery is much higher in terms of public engagement, but we're not perhaps recognising that quite so much as a discipline, particularly from an organisational point of view. An example of that might be if you're putting an aerial photo in a slide of a wider presentation about a site that you're giving, you're maybe not giving recognition to the fact that you are still using that photo as a resource. We asked people what they thought, what had been invested in the past, and what they thought would need to be invested in the future. So this splits down into 5 different categories, infrastructure, equipment, training, data, and staff. And what we can see on this graph is the discrepancy between what an individual's view on each of those needs are and the organisational view in terms of past and future investment. So as you can see, most organisations are planning to invest more in infrastructure than they are in staffing, for example. Perhaps indicating that they feel like they already have the human resource in place and they don't need any more specialists undertaking this sort of work, but they do need to be able to equip them with computers and servers and the ability to handle larger amounts of data. But what we can also see is that in the past, they are expecting, or organisations are expecting, a significant drop in investment in data itself. And this probably reflects the fact that we have far more open access data available to us than at any other time that people have been studying this. So I think there is a mirroring here of the expectation that we will not be needing to spend as much money acquiring data in the first place. Now, where that leaves specific survey acquisition programs is quite a big question. There's something to be asked there, I think, about the nature of proper bespoke prospective survey and where that sits within our discipline and why perhaps we're not thinking about investing in that alongside. So other things that were pulled up in terms of this particular part of the survey, in terms of investment, that there's a need for more training and education, that people generally felt that there weren't quite enough opportunities, both at the academic level, sort of formal training, but also within and between peers within the discipline. That basic image interpretation skills were essential, but alongside those, it was also the ability to understand the pitfalls. So what we're talking about here is two needs: a need for training, but then also a need for experience. Because to be honest, image interpretation skills are something that you only get by doing, aren't they? They're something that you have to do, you have to participate in. So to get experience, you have to be experienced. And then the final thing that sort of came out from, or Rachel pulled out from this particular part of the survey, is that the use and storage of data from remote sensing surveys was a constant kind of grit in the oyster, so to speak. It was something that was raised time and time again. How do we handle the large amounts of data? And certainly I can speak for the UK situation, is that where we have bespoke surveys, often those done on a project by project basis. At the end of the project, because the finances run out, the staff move on. And so that causes us a huge problem because we have no centralized repository for that data to go. So these data have been collected with public money, usually LiDAR data have been collected with public money. And at the end of a 3-year or a 5-year project, they sort of sit on a hard drive somewhere with the host organization who doesn't have the appropriate staff or skills or expertise to make those data available in the long term. Go. I'll quickly sort of whiz through these ones because they just, that was quicker than I was intending, sorry. So this just shows the difference in the countries' reporting of where they felt past investments had been. So once again, you can see that quite a lot of countries rated equipment quite highly as something that they've invested in the past. And then going forward, really it's sort of equipment and infrastructure, but staff, with a couple of exceptions, perhaps England, they're not expecting to make those same kind of investments in people. We asked people to rate the skills that they had and organisations to rate the skills that they wanted in order to try and understand the gap between what was available and what might be needed. So here we have an image demonstrating the top 5 held skills and the top 5 required skills. So looking at the number of instances where each of these were mentioned by respondents. So respondents in the left-hand column and organisations in the right-hand column. So the thing to pick apart here really, or the thing to notice, is that actually there's quite good correlation between the skills that are held and the skills that are wanted. We can see that Rachel's very kindly mapped this in colour. Apologies to anybody who is colourblind. You're going to have to read the text more carefully. But within the top 5 required skills, there's a relatively good match between what people feel they have to offer and what businesses are wanting. In terms of the long list, and what I should have said at that point is that the offer of more than 36 different types of skill were made. So people had a checklist to pick from. So when we talk about the top 5, we're not talking 5 of 10 skills. We're talking 5 out of 36 possible skill areas that were given. And then here is the long list. Once again, you can see, oh, sorry. That's what happens when you press the forward button rather than the laser. What you can see is there's a relatively good match, but as we look over the top 10, we're starting to see things being prioritised in a slightly different way. So, for example, organisations are prioritising GIS and map creation and the integration of aerial archaeology to wider project management, more than necessarily individuals are highlighting that as a skill set that they have or that they are applying in their day-to-day work. Rachel brought out some more data along these lines, so really looking at what that gap might look like, trying to quantify the gap. So we've got counts of each and trying to see where those gaps might be. So in terms of health skills and required skills, we can see that actually it's looking reasonably healthy in terms of some of these, so that they're quite low numbers here. So for example, scripting, we sort of feel like we have the right amount of people available within the employee cohort, but then others, so once again, GIS, map creation and editing, that's coming really quite high at the top. Now these percentages all look tiny, don't they? 2%, what is that? But you're talking about a relatively small number of professionals. So 2% across a body of people that's only 55 strong is actually, a number of people. And so we probably need to understand a little bit better how that gap actually manifests itself in terms of a lack of people with the available skills. What's also quite interesting is we asked each organisation to categorise themselves in terms of the number of people that they employed. And we start to see some discrepancies here between the sorts of skills that are required or wanted or needed through the different sizes of organisation. So really this reflects sort of what you'd expect in that smaller commercial organisations are sort of doing it all. And so they need sort of a rounder set of skills, including that high prioritization of integration with fieldwork. They want their staff to be able to do remote sensing and fieldwork and all the other things associated with it, indicating perhaps that they're not so interested in employing one particular specialist to do remote sensing, but that person needs to be an all-rounder, which makes perfect sense if you're a smaller organization. And then we can see that moving through the GIS management plan becomes more important as you start to specialize more when you're engaged with a larger commercial organization. And that correlation between GIS and data management and aerial archaeology and remote sensing obviously was touched on a lot this morning as we talked about the history of where we've come from and where we're going. But it shows you how important those skills are. And I do wonder to what extent we're really training those and upskilling people to be able to hold them, those technical skills, at the same time as having those really high quality interpretive skills. So not just being able to manage the data, but being able to understand it. That's just a personal observation. This slide will be kind of familiar to anybody who's been involved in any discussion about how well academia prepares people for the real world in archaeology. And so what we're seeing here is that things that are being prioritized within academic institutions are not necessarily being reflected across the board. So it's interesting to note the production of visualizations, calculating of indices, the more technical types of skill set are not really being read across. Is that because they're not seen as being quite as important within the commercial and institutional skills yet? I don't know. We need to ask a little bit more of that particular part of the survey, I think. But there does appear to be more of a mismatch when you consider academic versus commercial and institutional than when you consider individual and desired skills. Not to bore you too, because I do apologise sincerely that these slides are extremely small. However, the report is available for everybody to read, and we'll be sharing the links later, as is the whole data set that underpins this. So really the presentation that I'm giving today is an initial overview, some initial things that have jumped out from the data that have struck us as interesting or perhaps informative to the community. But the data itself has been anonymised and made available on a Zenodo repository, so anybody can go back and look at this data and start to pull out things that are of more interest to them. So here we can see a slide that is looking at the differences in skills held by individuals and those skills reported as needed on a country by country basis. And the thing really to take home from this, or that I think is important from this element, is that because we are a relatively small and specialised community, it means that the ability to locate a specialist within your geographical area might be quite limited. And so there is the potential there for not being, that even if we have a skill that is well represented, it might be well represented, but not within the geographical area in which it's most needed. So there is an importance there to looking at that spread of skills across the continent. So what do we think? What have we pulled out of this survey that we think is most needed? Looking forwards, what are we wanting to develop within our sector? So people highlighted the development of bespoke methods and algorithms, providing training in how to use these data sets. We've already touched upon that. And the coordination of different specialisms, archaeology and other technical specialisms, in order to progress the discipline. One of the things that was highlighted when it comes to organisational work and individuals' responses to how they felt their organisations were working for them is the ability to be able to connect the aims of the project to the choice of technology and the choice of data that is being used. And I think this perhaps indicates that there might be some issues around managerial or organisational understanding of what remote sensing can offer and what remote sensing can do. Technical interpretation and analysis skills, these have been highlighted as needed, and to my mind that really comes back down to the training as well. How do we structure training? How do we make that available? The ability to apply and deploy UAV, so that's highly required. And finally, big data management, so specialists and services that can help us leverage change from this. I mentioned before that there are qualitative responses as well that you can read. I'm hoping that we've anonymized them enough that people can't work out who it was, but maybe you can hear somebody's voice in your head as you read through these. I think I certainly can in some instances. So once again, highlighting things that I've already mentioned as part of this talk, that we feel like there are that interaction of data management and interpretation really needs work, that this is a specialist skilled area and that we're perhaps not supporting people well enough, particularly through the tertiary education cycle, so through universities. How much experience do people get? How much training do they get as part of their degree? And I thought this was quite an interesting, that in fact, the many areas are still really seeing archaeology, and we've touched on this a little bit this morning as well, and sort of in Ukraine, archaeology is still very much seen as the excavation of archaeology and not the wider discipline. So how do we integrate the stuff that we do and the stuff that we're interested in, that we know can make an impact within the wider discipline and the wider management? And this comes back to where the EAC will sit and how they will work with the results of this survey on that management, that cultural heritage management level. I'm going to skip through this one because we're running a little bit short on time, but there is still an indication, a sort of intimation that remote sensing is not trusted, it's not accepted perhaps in the way that it should be. So the question really, and the challenge for us as a discipline, is how do we take on board some of this feedback? How do we move forward with it? So how can we make our work more integrated? How do we advocate for ourselves so that there's not that so much of a mismatch between what we do and what we want to do, and what organisations want us to do or what we want to be able to contribute? And some of those sort of bigger questions that are relevant to AARG. So what is it that we want to achieve here? I noticed Lukash mentioned that he was having a midlife crisis, so maybe that's something that he's going to be raising as the future chair. And the final note that I would kind of like to make, and I won't make you raise your hands now in the room, but when we asked for responses, more than 60% of people who responded were not AARG members. So what we should take as a group from that is, who are those people? Why are they not part of our group? How can we help them to be part of our group? What is it that we're not offering that would be useful to them? What is it that they have that could synthesize and be useful to us as a group? A little bit of outreach work to do there. So my very final slide, or Rachel's very final slide, there will be a report on this in AARG News, which will probably be much nicer than sitting and listening to me about it. The data has been archived on Zenodo, so you can access that for yourself and go and have a dig around on it. As I mentioned, this is supposed to be the first of a series of baseline surveys undertaken in the same manner, so that we can start to look at change over time. And then finally, to look with both the AARG and the EAC working group at the sort of actions that we could take from this survey that would help to better serve our community in the short, medium and longer term. Thank you so much for listening.